and welcome to the DM's Book Club, a weekly book club podcast where we talk about some Dungeons & Dragons and discuss how we might include it in our role-playing campaigns. Except we're not doing that this week. No more Dungeons & Dragons. I've booted it to the side because we have a wonderful guest co-host on. We have the wonderful Matt, the Bad Spot, here with us. Hello, Matt. How are you doing, my friend?
I am doing wonderfully well. I'm very excited to be here. I always get thrilled to be asked on, and I always wonder if there's been some awful mistake. You've been misinformed about why I'm here.
You're like that guy on the BBC News going, "Oh, I've been interviewed about the wrong thing." So
yeah, exactly. But no, I'm very pleased to be here and to chop it up with you.
Fantastic. So, for those people who don't know who you are or what you do in the TTRPG sphere, what do you do in the world of TTRPGs, Matt?
It kind of basically boils down to one thing. Like, yes. I've inadvertently become known as the Ironsworn guy. Yes. So Ironsworn is a solo RPG, and I started playing the sci-fi version of that on YouTube in 2021. It's called Ironsworn Starforged, and now as a result, I think I might have the most amount of recorded Ironsworn Starforged on the internet.
Yeah.
And I make a bunch of like how-to content, and that is quite popular because a lot of people don't understand how to get into solo gaming and obviously go straight to YouTube to look for help and guidance. And I've kind of made this almost university like online degree in Ironsworn. If anyone ever wants it, they can find the stuff on my channel. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I've been playing, talking to myself on the internet for the best part of the last 3 years. Mm-hmm. But of late, I've been playing a lot of different games on the channel. I've had you on my channel. We played Trophy Dark together.
Yes.
And generally, I'm interested in any kind of narrative first, story first, role-playing games, and the theory behind them, the practice behind them. I'm fascinated by their design and their intricacies, and yeah, that's kind of what I talk about mostly on when I'm not playing either a kind of depressed spacer or a horny pirate on my show. I'm talking about role-playing games with guests and just the camera by myself. So yeah, that's generally what I do.
So did you start out then with solo games or something? I know creating content since 2021, but did you play RPGs before then? Like, how did you get into playing them?
I got into playing role-playing games very late in life. So I actually played when I was in my early teens, but not properly. Mm-hmm. And it was a kid on my street owned the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Other Strangeness RPG, which is
amazing.
A dreadful game, but it has one of the funnest character creations in it, because I don't know if you're familiar with the game, but you essentially have a lot of tables and you roll up a random animal that is randomly mutated in certain ways, and you instantly have all these kind of backstories. And I loved the Turtles as a kid. I was a child of the early 90s, so like that was really in my wheelhouse, and the kid on my street had it. And I borrowed the book of him, and I just rolled up characters all summer. I just rolled up characters, never played the game, just rolled up characters and made stat blocks and everything. And that was kind of it. He had Call of Cthulhu as well, which I don't know what edition that would have been in like the early 90s, but we played a bit of that, and I kind of didn't really understand that you were supposed to solve a mystery. I just wanted to shoot ghouls in the face. And I don't think we played it properly, but then that was it. And then after that, I didn't have anything to do with role-playing games until 2014, which is quite some time later, like 22 years later. Mm-hmm. So that was a couple of friends of mine said that they wanted to try playing D&D. And it just weirdly at the same time, I had become aware of the Fantasy Flight Star Wars role-playing game. It uses what's now known as the Genesis system. Mm-hmm. And I was just reading about it, and I don't really know how I stumbled across it, but the idea that you had these custom dice and there was no kind of binary success, and you had to kind of interpret the symbols, these eldritch symbols on the dice, and kind of work out what happened. And to me, that sounded super interesting. So I bought the book and I bought a set of dice, and I just said, well, do you want to play this instead? And everyone were like, well, actually, we prefer Star Wars to Dungeons and Dragons, so let's do this.
Yeah.
So we started a campaign of that. And after that, I think I was properly kind of bitten by the bug of running games and playing games. I laugh when I think about how I did those games now, because I gravitate towards games now that don't require any prep, that are about discovering a story as you go, about sharing a narrative. But I was writing kind of like 15,000 words a week of like stuff that with all this prep. You got to go there to come back, right? You got to learn your lessons somehow. Yeah. So we played that, and then when that finished, then I discovered Dungeon World. So I started playing. That was my first PBTA game. My friend sent me a copy of that. I ran an entire campaign of that took about 2 years.
Wow.
And then after that, I was just like super, super interested in just finding more and more interesting narrative-driven story-first games. And then I happened to come across Ironsworn. I think it was on like an article on Polygon or something, and it was just like, hey, there's a cool game. It's powered by the apocalypse, sort of, and you play it by yourself. And I was like, well, that's weird. I don't know how that works. And I sat down and played it, and I was like, this is for me.
Yeah.
So playing games like that, it kind of hit that medium spot between a game and creative writing. And when I figured out a way to make it interesting and into a kind of watchable show, that's where it all kind of started to click into place for me. And then the kind of stone goes into the pond, right? And the ripples kind of spread out and out. And then you suddenly start to find more games, and you realize where the design from your favorite games comes from. And then you look at those games, and then all of a sudden you're playing games 6 nights a week. And,
maybe a problem.
Yeah, I didn't start with solo games, but I kind of ended up there and it was driven mainly by lockdown, because I actually said I used to present or co-host a film podcast for, I think, 7.5 years, because that's my background. I'm from film and theatre. And I love doing that, but we kind of, it run its course. And, after a while, you kind of just, two white guys with beards having opinions about films on the internet is not really unique, is it? So like we kind of wrapped that up, and I said I really want to do something, and I really wanted to do an actual play, but with my group who were playing Dungeon World, but organizing 4 adults into one space.
Oh, it's dreadful. I can't even do it now, like for anything. So yeah, no, I feel that pain.
I suddenly realized that probably wasn't a good idea, and then when I discovered Ironsworn, I was like, hey, this might be a good idea. And then when they announced Starforged, I'm going to say famously, I notoriously put a tweet out that said, the day this drops, I will start an AP of it. And what I didn't realize was if you backed the Kickstarter, you got the preview edition on day one.
Ah, cool.
So the Kickstarter launched, and then I think 4 or 5 days later, I had a session 0 and a first episode out. And
amazing.
Yeah, 3 years later, here I am.
Here you are, yeah. So no, I definitely see, and what you were saying before about people coming to YouTube to find out how to play RPGs in general, but also solo games, because I do think that's quite important. A lot of times, like I've done it myself for where I've done lots of solo plays, and I've put them out, and they are meant to be like a reflective, maybe intimate sort of experience. But I think people really enjoy seeing people being able to put that and go, oh, so that's what you did with this prompt. That's very interesting. And I've had that back as well. So I do find it interesting how a solo game meant for one player, for your experience, and then you put it out for other people to enjoy. It feels almost like not an oxymoron, but like that sort of like, oh, you enjoyed my very personal thing about the horny pirate or the sad, it's the sad spacer. I just find it interesting, and it's something I would not have considered when I first started out, is like doing lots of solo games myself, but because of that restriction of like trying to get enough people to run a game and going, oh, here's an alternative that I can do, or do a one-on-one or anything like that. I think nowadays it is more seen as an option, but definitely like 5 or 6 years ago when I first started, I was like, that's going to be super boring for everyone involved apart from me. But no, people do enjoy it.
And it's cool how many games now come with a solo mode as well. And I think that, I mean, in board games, it's been kind of going that way for a while. And there's a lot of co-op board games as well. And any co-op board game can be a solo board game. But I really like the idea that people are including solo modes or solo modules in role-playing games, because it's a really interesting way to play. And I think as soon as I started playing Ironsworn by myself, I think I'd been playing about half an hour. And I was like, yeah, this is instantly making me a better DM. Like the idea that I'm having to think on my feet, I've got nothing. And I've kind of used this kind of analogy before. Like I now, and I know it's very personal about how people play games and how people prep games and everything, but me now, I cannot think of anything more boring for me than for me to write a whole bunch of stuff and watch my friends play around in it. And I know that some players want that. They want, a sandpit to play in. But I think I've come to the point where it's like, I want 3 or 4 people to stand with me on the edge of this cliff and hold my hand, and we're all going to step off together. And I have no idea what's going to happen, but it's going to be amazing because the thrill of that. And I think I found when I was prepping lots and lots of things, the things I remember from those sessions are the things that came up on the fly.
Absolutely.
Or that just came out of, the random character you had to make up to plug a gap somewhere. And all of a sudden that became a very, important part of your whole campaign that, lasts for multiple years. So I was just like, well, let's make the whole thing like that. And I think I've just kind of gravitated to games like that. And solo games is perfect for that because you don't have modules in a lot of things, because you can't have a module, because if you look at it, you know where it's going. So you're just kind of asking yourself those questions. And to revert to your point, like about people coming online to see how to do it, I think people, if it's a solo game that's like a journaling game, people kind of get it because they've got a prompt and they write. Okay, especially something like I saw it on your show. Was it Dead Letter Society? The kind of
the vampires like letting back and forth.
It's clear what you have to do. Yes. If you sit down and play Ironsworn, and you're like, well, hang on, what do I do? Do I do a voice? Do I say the thing? What am I thinking of? And it's actually been a bit of a double-edged sword for me, because I started my show sitting down, pressing record and playing the game, but that was an absolute fucking nightmare, right? my recordings were like 5 or 6 hours. It was just a nightmare. So I very quickly developed this way of playing for a bit, walking away, having a think about where the stories were going, trying to and then that in turn has morphed over the course of 60 plus episodes to, I never play the game. I'm always playing the game all week. I have my dice app on my phone. I have my notes app. And essentially, I don't call my show an actual play anymore, because really it's an adaptation of my actual play. Because I'm playing the game as I go throughout my week and throughout my job and stuff. And I basically have these notes, and then I just sit down and I record and I tell you what happened, essentially. And it's really funny because, like, I get comments a lot saying, God, this is so slick. You're so good at this game. And I have to say, no, I'm not. This is made for entertainment purposes. This is my game, right? But I'm doing it in such a way because I got to this point quite early where I was like, this is fun to play the game for people, but it's also, I'm making a show for an audience. When people started to give me feedback, they were invested in the characters. I was like, I better be responsible. I don't want to die on a random roll. Like, let's think a bit more about this. And there were whole episodes where I just never rolled the dice, where I'd just be kind of just taking this loose story and filling it out in this world that's kind of in this loose kind of confines of being a game. So my stuff that I put out really blurs the lines between actual play and audio drama, I guess. Yeah. But I think it's really amazing to have the option to play solo for a lot of games, just so you can kind of experience that thrill of stepping off the cliff.
And as you said, like a lot of solo things, like I've played a few of like Call of Cthulhu have like Alone Against their sort of, like you said, like the solo modules and stuff. And that is very choose your own path, choose your own adventure, but teaches you the rules as you go along, which is invaluable as, like you said, not only you learning the rules, but then going, well, I can now graduate from choose your own path to what else can I do? And I definitely appreciate that. And I find that interesting that you said like an adaptation of your actual play because you're constantly playing. I never really thought of it like that, because I feel like, because I never stream my solo stuff just because of that worry of going, well, I've screwed it up. I always either pre-record or I edit stuff out, etc. But then I don't tend not to write things down. I tend to like talk aloud about the prompt and then go write my notes and then speak aloud what happened. But obviously delete me typing and going, that's spelt wrong and fucking hell, like just like general sort of thing. So it's interesting. I don't think there was like a true capturing. It is a performance, like you said, of the actual play and adaptation, which I thought was good. But we're not talking about solo players today.
No.
But even though you tried to trick me into talking about it, but similarly, talking about a game that you need very little prep for, really, and also the players don't need that much prep for. So, Matt, what are we talking about today? What is our topic of choice for DM's Book Club?
Well, when I'm not being the Iron Swan guy, I seem to have become an unofficial champion of the Between.
Yes.
Which is a game by Jason Cordova about monster hunters in an alternate Victorian London. But even saying that is doing the game a disservice. If you're familiar with Jason's work, then you might know of Brindlewood Bay, which is a kind of a cozy murder mystery thing where some old grannies try and solve murders, but then uncover this Cthulian mythos going on in their small kind of New England town or wherever it is. The exciting thing about the game is that it's driven by this shared narrative authority between you and the character, you and the players, and it really is one of the most thrilling experiences I've ever had around a table. And also, like, I can tell that there are people who sit down to play it and they'll be like, oh, absolutely not. This is not for me, because it is very much if you don't like defining the snack that's been taken round at the ball that you're attending that reminds you of your hometown, then you are going to struggle with this. But if you're someone who likes telling a joint story and a shared story, and you like the challenge of working backwards as a character, then The Between is an incredible game, and I could talk about it forever. And I invariably end up doing. I've made a couple of long gushing videos about The Between.
Very lucky enough to have Jason come on and do a 2-shot for us. And before then, I hadn't read any of his work. I hadn't really heard of Brindlewood Bay, but I hadn't read it, and I hadn't heard of The Between. And I remember, because I am someone, and I know it sounds so silly, but I'm someone that doesn't necessarily do romance and relationships in games, just because, again, just that sort of thing. I was just not interested, and absolute full props to Jason. He, with that sort of monster hunters in Victorian era, so that Penny Dreadfuls, everything is very sexy. You can't get away from it. And I was just suddenly stunned by going, oh, this is what we want in games. It's not just like constant sort of like PDA or anything like that, but it was just so different. It was so subtle, and I'd never experienced that before as a player. And suddenly now I'm like, well, I want to do that in more games. I want to have those themes in other games. And it was very eye-opening, not only his way of GMing, but also the game itself was so simple. And I'd played a couple of Powered by the Apocalypse games before, but as you sort of said, it is a mixture of that and Card from Brindlewood Bay to have this sort of mystery element in it as well. Because just on what you said about, like, maybe it's not for everyone, would this be a game that you would introduce to brand new people to RPGs then? Or would you give it one or two or something else and then try it?
Here's an interesting thing, Fiona, right? Yeah. So I have run exactly one campaign of The Between, but I have run it from start to finish.
Yeah.
And like I said, it was by far the best experience I've ever had playing role-playing games. And, probably one of the most rewarding creative things I've ever done. And I'm someone who's done a lot of different creative things. And it was absolutely unbelievable. But the interesting thing about the people I played it with, that I had 4 players. One person who was relatively well-versed in Powered by the Apocalypse games, had run a couple of Powered by the Apocalypse games and had certainly read an awful lot of them. One person who'd played a lot of role-playing games, but essentially D&D and D&D adjacent. Vampire the Masquerade, probably the most different one. One person who'd only played D&D. And one person who had never played a role-playing game before.
Gosh, wow.
Now, when I started that campaign, I was like, this has the potential to go very badly.
Yes.
And what I would say is that I don't think any game is inappropriate to introduce to someone as their first game, that they need support. 100%, right?
Yeah.
And I felt confident, even though I'd never run the game before. I'd watched a bunch of Jason playing it, which is actually will give you false confidence, because that guy is a fucking magician, I swear.
Yeah.
And I'd read a lot, I'd kind of absorbed a lot, and I felt comfortable after about 3 sessions. I felt perfectly like this, I can do this, right? But like, I knew that if it came to her and she would freeze, there would be people round the table that would help her out. And nice. That was the great thing that I had there. Had I gone with 4 people who'd never played a role-playing game before,
right,
I'd probably do a one-shot of Brindlewood Bay if you're going to do something like that.
Yeah.
But The Between asks a lot of hard questions of the players, and especially if you're going to go into it hoping to do the entire campaign, then your players need to bring something to the table. And she looked so confused the first time we started playing because she didn't even really have any concept of what a role-playing game was. She didn't really. The only thing she knew about Dungeons and Dragons was like watching Stranger Things or whatever, vaguely knowing what it was and what you're supposed to do. And it wasn't really until, because the Between is played in phases, a dawn, a day, a dusk, and a night phase. And each phase has their own rules and their own feel. But one of the most amazing things about the game is this thing called the Unseen, which is where the players narrate these prompts, which depicts something else happening in London. And what it does over the period of, 12 or 14 sessions is it helps paint London in this kind of vivid detail. But the thing is, it's not connected in any way to what you're doing. And we started with one of my favorite unseens, which is called Moonlight Mudlarking, which is about people on the Thames digging for trash and or like digging for treasure, trying to find stuff. And she got the last prompt and it came to her and she just looked terrified.
Oh no.
And she was kind of struggling, and she asked me for the prompt again, and I gave her the prompt again. And then my friend Rich, who was the guy who was pretty well versed in Powered by the Apocalypse games, but this was new to him, he just said to her, just tell us a story. And she then just said, I think she was describing this woman digging around in the mud. She said, I think she's found a piece of porcelain. So then we all were like, well, what's on the porcelain? What does this woman look like? Where is she? And she told this most tender, heartbreaking little story that was only about 3 minutes long.
Yeah.
And it was after she was done with her prompt, we were just like, not only do you get it, but I feel like we all get it. That was the moment that it clicked, right? In Latin America, when musicians play together, they have this phrase that when it's all starting to click, they say El Duende is in the room. It means like the imp is in the room, and there is this feeling that everyone knows, right?
Yeah.
And everyone can feel it. That was when El Duende turned up at our table.
Oh.
She got it. And then from then on in, everything clicked. And from that moment on, everyone was on the same page and everyone knew what was going on. That could have gone very differently, right? I've played with people who would clam up, or they just wouldn't feel confident digging for the information themselves. Most people will get there if you hold their hand or give them more. But the Between kind of requires, after a while, everyone to be able to handle the narrative spotlight when you give it to them. And the reason it does that is because, you're not allowed to discuss your backstory unless you kind of fail a dice roll, essentially. It's more complicated than that. But so to be ready with that information, and I think you only get like 12 opportunities throughout the campaign to deliver a piece of backstory. So when it comes to you need to have something. And I think that's why the Between perhaps has a slightly higher, not barrier to entry, but a slightly higher demand on the player, I think.
I agree. Yeah, I think because a lot of times when I've run role-playing games, a lot of times in the before times or whenever, but like, it used to be like DM gives you everything, and then as you said, they play around in the sandpit a little bit. But now I think that expectation is like, well, what do you see? What do you do? And it's not wrong. And I agree, it's that setting that expectation of people going, oh, but what if I say something wrong? What if I don't know? And it's like, well, we'll find out together. That's sort of, as you said, stepping off the cliff and just seeing what happens. And then we're all on the same page and supporting it. And I was going to say, the Unseen is one of my favorite things I've ever found in a role-playing game, because as you said, it's this two dual narratives happening at the same time that don't affect each other, but you can have echoes in the night, so where you can echo something. So say, for example, there's a big party happening and there's like, I don't know, a lady dressed in a bubble dress or something, and then you cut to a drinking at a tavern and the bubbles happen there, and you're like, well, that counts as an echo in the night, and people getting excited that there are these connections even if the narratives aren't the same. And it's something, at that particular Unseen stuff, I've been trying to do it in improv and trying to get improvisers to try and do two narratives that don't solve each other, they just happen at the same time, and then use the connections. And when it works, it is spectacular. When it doesn't, it is dreadful. So I feel like I've got it. Yeah, it's that sort of thing where I think it is that setting expectations and having that support around the players who are new to it to be like, no, go for it. What is it? What do you do? And then that sounds like that story. It's something like, shit, none of us could have come up with something like that. You did that. And that's really impressive.
When we sit and talk about the campaign and what it was like, because I think the one thing that she didn't realize, she was like, "Oh, it's over now." And when it finished, there was tears and everyone was just like hugging. It was just such an amazing end to it. The end was so perfect, and it was like, I'm really apprehensive about playing again now.
I know, right?
But the thing is, she was like, "I can't believe it's finished," and we were all saying to her, "You finished a campaign of a role-playing game.
Yes.
Already you are in the top percentile of people, because we're the same. Everyone who was into role-playing games has started more campaigns than they've finished, right? And I think I could finish my next 50 in a row and I would still never catch up to the amount that I've never, I've kind of had to abandon or whatever. She had no conception of something being abandoned after a few sessions, and then you occasionally meet every now and then and say, "Oh, we should really pick up that game again."
It was really good, wasn't it?
So it was like, it was amazing, and I feel a little bit like, as well, we've spoiled role-playing games for her, because she's
I was going to say that the bar is now so high that she's never going to have the same end because I was the same. My first campaign of D&D, and we did it for 5 years. We got all the way to the end. We had we laughed, we cried, all that sort of thing. And unfortunately, since then, I've not been able to, again, because of the expanse of time, I've not been able to hit that high. But what I have discovered is that the more sessions you play, suddenly you're like, oh, it's not ending after 2 sessions. Great, I get to play a little bit more. And then I've got into the habit, this is peak Fiona, I will say, like, I just suddenly go, I'll just create a playlist for my character. And I'm like, oh no, I've turned into my 15-year-old self again and just have playlists for everything.
This has been a big switch, actually. Like, the idea that, if you said to me, we're going to play a game, right? And if I said, well, how long is it going to last? And you said, well, it's open-ended. I would instantly fall off my chair, right? Because I think I've realized, by playing a lot of these narrative first games, that the idea that your character's story ends is incredibly powerful. Because the thing is, if you play, and this is absolutely no shade on those campaigns that last like 20 years or whatever, if that's your bag, fill your boots. I don't, that's great. And I'm just thrilled that you're having a good time, because, having a good time with your friends is ultimately the thing, right?
Yeah.
But like, the idea that you do that, your character doesn't have an arc. They just get increasingly better, right? So they get more powerful, and the obstacles they overcome just become more challenging, right? But the idea that with the between, the implication is you're going to play for 12, 13 sessions. Not all of you are going to make it.
No.
Those that do make it will be explicitly changed, and you will have to retire them, and you are not coming back for the second season. It's mechanically designed that way, apart from the character of the Undeniable, who is kind of immortal and can live forever. But that's the outlier of that game. But the idea that my players were coming to the table and they were like, well, I know I'm going to, and we had this, didn't we, when we played Trophy Dark? Your character is going to meet an end.
Yeah.
So why not make your character's beginning, middle, and end the most interesting thing you can?
Yeah.
Like this, like a self-contained arc that tells its own story. And, the amount of, like, I think I had 4 people, 2 people didn't make it out of the between, but like, to have them mark that last mask to say, this means my character will die, and be like, right, I now know I have got until the end of this session to describe my ending. And one of my characters, my friend Rich, who played the American on that.
Oh, nice.
The Americans thing is they're a werewolf, basically. Or they're a creature. He was a Wendigo.
Oh,
and
nice.
His story had come out slowly over the course of the whole campaign, and he hit a bad roll, and he was like, I'll mark the mask and this will be my end. And his ending was, it was so cinematic. It was, and you could tell that he'd thought about it, but it wasn't like people had thought about their characters when they write 10,000 words of backstory and turn up and expect you to work it in. Like, he had slowly pieced that together over the course of, like, 3, 4, 5 months, and delivered it to the most satisfying conclusion he could have had. And to think that we could have ended that story and that campaign, and that my players could have defeated that mastermind, and then the American's still going next year. Just like, that's not quite as exciting as having this this end in mind. Having control over your character's destiny as a player is actually incredibly freeing and incredibly like kind of profound to say, I know I know how I'm going to go out. You and I, we're going to play the Wild Sea soon. That game has that built in. Like you can choose, you can go down to, there's no hit points or whatever, but you can go down to a point where you have arbitrarily ticked off these things on the character sheet, which means your story is over, but it doesn't mean like, oh, sorry, Fiona died on her way back to her home planet. It means you get to choose. You tell us, how do you want that? How do you want to go out? And when I read about those mechanics in games, you see some people react vehemently to them. They just don't like that at all. They want. I've recently had some comments on my channel. I did a how to do combat in Ironsworn video, because combat trips a lot of people up in a solo game because they're not really sure how it's supposed to work. And combat in Ironsworn is very narrative based. It's about objectives. The objective in a fight isn't to reduce man to 0 hit points. It's like to escape the castle or whatever.
Yeah. And
this person was like, when you take harm, it shouldn't be pay the price, which is the move you make when something goes wrong, which gives you a whole bunch of options. You should always take a hit to your hit points. And I'm like, you've only got 5 hit points. Like, if you fight anything hard, you're going to be dead instantly. He was like, yeah, but that's the game. And I was like, oh, come on, man.
Yeah,
this clearly isn't a game for you, but like, you've got to see why people might like that over you get to 0, you're dead.
It's the slow burn of it, isn't it? It's exactly what you said. Like that idea that you come to this game, you take the playbook or the archetype, and you don't know anything about them until you have those flashbacks, and then building it up slowly. It's one of the things I love about improv is that you can do that slow burn and just have these scenes full of silence and stuff. And some people absolutely hate it. They feel awkward. They have to fill the space and something. But I've had some absolutely cracking improv scenes where we've not spoken for ages, and we can feel there is something there. And it's like you said, like there's everyone in the room knowing to take the time and having that suspense and having that emotional connection. Not all people like that. They want again, it's a different kind of style to play, but I think the Between does it so beautifully. And that, as you said, that idea of the masks. So when you fail a role, you as the storyteller get to tell like what happens in horrible graphic detail and stuff, and then they go, no, I'm going to put on a mask because that's not how my story ends. The Prince of Persia, like, no, let's try that again, sort of thing. But then it goes to the player, like, well, okay, give us this flashback about something from their youth or something, like a very simple prompt. That's what I think all of Jason Cordova's stuff is like this, but it's so well written and the prompts are so short that it doesn't matter if you give the big monologue or something, or if you just do a very short thing. I just think it gives you enough to be like, oh, I hadn't thought about what were they like 20 years ago when they were just starting out, and what happened when I think Brindlewood Bay is like, give us a flashback of when you were a bad mother. And you're like, oh no,
Jesus. I think I've said this before on again one of my effusively gushing videos I've made about The Between on my channel. But when I heard The Between pitched, it just said, "Oh, it's Powered by the Apocalypse, Victorian era London, kind of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen vibes." Mm-hmm. I just thought it was going to be like Monster of the Week, but with a kind of LXG type reskin, right? Then I actually read it. When I read about what the masks did, I was like, that's incredible. And then, did you have the Explorer in your game?
We didn't, I don't think, no.
I don't think you would have known. So Explorers aren't, the playbook of the Explorer isn't really very good for like a one shot or a two. So, and before I said 2 shots, Fiona, and now should be known as double taps.
Double taps. I love it.
I believe I've heard that bandied around, and that should be the nomenclature going forward.
I prefer that to one shots, 2 shots. Yeah. Double tap, I like that
double
a lot.
Tap.
Yeah.
So the Explorer is a character who changes how the Between is played, because when you start, they already know who the mastermind is because they have a relationship with them.
Oh, interesting.
So most of the characters in the Between, they have a series of what they call masks of the past, and like Fiona says, something goes wrong, you mark a mask, and it says, narrate, from a time when you were a bad mother, or narrate a time that your parents treated you terribly, or that someone wronged you, or whatever. The Explorer, their masks, because obviously this is an anti-colonialist game, but everyone in the game is a real Victorian bastard, and the Explorer is no different. It's someone who has served Queen and country overseas, and all of that, what that implies with the history of the British Empire. All of the Explorer's masks are narrated from the point of view of a character called the Boy, who is a boy in a village that the explorers regiment has conquered.
Oh.
And as soon as I read that, I was like, oh, that's fucking good.
Wow.
That's incredible. And then that's when I was completely sold on the game. Also, just a quick thing, which it stems from your game that you played with Jason, because I listened to your game before I played my first one, because I was trying to get as many different versions of it as possible.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And there was still some parts of running the threats, because if you don't know, listeners at home, like the keeper or the GM has basically a threat, which is the kind of the case that you're working on.
Yeah.
And it's 2 sides of A4. That's all it is.
Yeah.
And everything on there is very basically sketched out. And it's kind of up to you and the players to bring it to life in however way you want to see fit, which means that every time you speak to anyone who's played the Between, even though they've all played the same cases, some of them they might have played with the exact same playbooks. They play out wildly differently.
Yes.
And you guys, I think your first threat that you played was the Spider Silk Seamstress.
Oh, yeah, horrible.
And I remember you played that one, and there was one of your characters, one of your players around the table, was investigating the person who's murdered at the start of that case, their apartment, and a jaguar came out of the wardrobe.
Wardrobe, yes, absolutely.
And I was like, oh, shit, I don't remember that being in the threat. I might have to go back and reread that. So I went back and reread the Spider Silk Seamstress threat, and that's not in there.
No, of course not.
And I was like, now I get how you do this.
Yeah.
So it's like, that the fact that the jaguar came out of the wardrobe was based on a question that Jason had asked you that's built into the game's introduction. I think he asked one of your players at the start when he's introducing the threat, what about the description of the Fae is something that runs through history? And I think your player said something about a glint in the eyes, that like art and, literature, people of the Fae realm are described as having a certain glint in their eyes.
Yeah.
And the first encounter that happens is a mistroll or whatever, and a jaguar comes out that's got a glint in its eye, and it's like,
yes, I remember now.
You son of a bitch. And that gave me so much confidence to think, right, okay, well, I'm not desperately just trying to shoehorn everything from the sheet in. And when I ran the Between, there were threats where, like, we didn't even go to half the locations, or we didn't even bring in half the characters. There were characters in my game that were like incidental comic relief on the page that turned out to be central to the arcs of my players. And, it is a truly ingenious game that gives you so much variation. And I when I saw the game and read the threats, I was like, this is really restrictive. And then when you start playing, you're like, oh no, this is actually ultimate freedom. Yes. I have the written on the back of a napkin version of a module. And do you know what? You can tear up wherever you want. You can, as long as you're keeping with the themes and the basic premise of this threat, you can kind of do what you want. And a lot of the time you don't. You always fall back on those characters that exist because I say well written. They're only like a sentence or something. They're very brief, but they're written so evocatively that like there's so much to go with. Yeah. And having that freedom is just, is a gift.
We talked about it when we did Trophy Gold as well. That idea that most of their scenarios is just a page with little bits and pieces. And the Gauntlet did publish that as well. But it's that sort of thing where I don't need 3 or 4 big pages of like content and stuff like that. I need words on a page where I can then improv it myself and not worry about having to remember lots of things. Because that's, as you said, like it gets to a point where I'm saying, I have no idea where the story's going to go. But as long as the players are invested, I want to keep up with them and be able to bat it back to them instead of going, well, actually, they've gone completely off path. Because I think that's the thing with more prep and more writing, the more likely that they won't follow the thing. And you've wasted that time when, like you said, you could be doing some solo games and practicing your own sort of improv skills and stuff like that. And I know this is a very hard question, especially because I know you've looked and had a preview of the next edition of The Between. But is there a part of the game itself that you, I don't want to say struggle with, but it's something that you're like not so sure about? Like, you've come up against it like time and again, and you're like, not for me, and you've left out perhaps when you ran your campaign a bit.
There wasn't, but there was definitely elements of it that I struggled with more than others. And I think the main one was the vulnerable scene. So you won't have seen it in your first session, but in the second session you would have had it. So
we did it, yeah.
There are no hit points in the between, but you get conditions. So like you might go and investigate a haunted house and take the condition frightened, and that stays with you until you clear it. But the way you clear it is by sharing an intimate moment with another hunter. And that sounds like, it basically just means a quiet, private moment. It can mean a sexual or intimate moment in that way. And a lot of games do go that. The between has a very erotic, I don't want to say subtext, it's right there in the text.
Oh, no, it's
right?
definitely there.
Yeah, it's there. So, every day of the game, like I said, it's broken into these phases, starts with, hunters saying what they want to do with the day. They might want to go and investigate. They might want to go and explore London and show a little bit of their private lives, or they might be chocked full of conditions from last night's adventure, and they have to have a vulnerable scene to clear it. And I think that me and my players struggled with that because they didn't quite understand, and I didn't, to be honest, to help them, how, like, let's say you break your leg. How am I going to have an intimate scene with someone when and the whole point of it is you're supposed to be indulging in your vice, right?
Yes,
and let's say your vice is coffee. Well, how do I have a scene with someone where I'm indulging in coffee and my leg gets better? And it's like, and we kind of just struggled with it. And then it's just, actually, what if, you're describing how you two talked about, and you have this little scene where you're talking about your problems whilst you are staying up all night drinking so much coffee that you can kind of be wired to fix this amazing elaborate steampunk splint round your leg. And it's like when they kind of got that, they really got into it. But I feel like in our campaign, a lot of the best vulnerable scenes came towards the end of the campaign when it finally clicked for them.
Absolutely.
And what's interesting about the vulnerable scenes as well is naturally your table will split off into kind of pairings, or kind of people who interact, because unlike other games where you are encouraged not to split the party, splitting the party is inevitable in the between, because you just can't do it all. And also it's amazing when you all go off and do different things. And I've always said that, like, don't split the party is actually bad advice. I think that GMs just need to be better at cutting between action.
Exactly.
The amount of times that I've been in a split party and I've been sat there twiddling my thumbs. But the thing is, with the between, you cut, it's in the rules, you cut when a dice roll is failed. So someone's like, I'm going to jump across this gap, but they roll the dice, it's failed. And you're like, okay, over to you. And it's like,
exactly.
So you need to be ready. So you're always invested, right? In vulnerable scenes, people invariably kind of pair off, and our American and our undeniable were, they had storylines that were very similar, so they ended up having a lot of scenes together. Then we had the mother, who is like the Dr. Frankenstein archetype, and the factotum, who is their kind of like manservant or whatever. You were the factotum, I remember, in your game. So they had a lot of scenes together, but there was, towards the end, the story kind of moved to a point where people were having scenes together who had never shared a scene in like 14 weeks.
That's so
and it was really interesting because like they realize when they start the scene, I actually don't know this about you because we've never been in a scene together. So that's really interesting. But I think there's nothing in the between that's not for me. But like in terms of, if you were to write my perfect game with every box ticked for me, the between would be, actually, I really struggled with custom moves. So later on in the game, when you level up, you get to players can come to you and say, I want to write a custom move. And luckily, one of my players, hugely experienced with PBTA games, and also had read a lot. So he came to me with this move that was so well written. But then another one of my players, we just never managed to figure out this right custom move for him, because I was like, and I think if I was a bit better or understood the game a bit more, there's a lot of guidance in the book, it didn't quite kind of click with me. And I really, in the end, I don't think we actually ended up giving him the kind of custom move, which is a shame, because that's kind of going to become your signature as you you find out that that's what your character's about. So like our American, for example, turned out to be an amazing dancer. So he wrote a move called the Hips Don't Lie, and it was a beautiful move and it worked really well, and he used it a lot.
That's awesome.
And that was good because it was different to the moves that he had on his playbook.
Right, yeah.
And really brought that character to life in a unique way for that table. But yeah, I really struggle with that. But yeah, in terms of content wise, I would say that content wise, can be a really tough sell, and it says it right up front in the book that, you know, there is some pretty rough stuff in that book, and like you know, one of the characters, the mother, her playbook revolves around her stealing body parts to build a ragtag like monstrosity that is there to help her get over her grief of a loved one she lost. So if that sounds a little too much, then maybe don't play it. But the game's very open and honest about it, right? And you know, it takes its safety very seriously.
And just to go back on what you're saying there, I actually do find as a GM conditions to give out very hard. I had it because I ran the Brindlewood Bay, and it has some absolutely great advice about, you know, what to do and hard moves and stuff like that. And often it is like, give them a condition of some sort, and then it does give like a suggested conditions and stuff. And often I'll be like, I can't think of in the moment. And especially again, I know I keep going back to it. The way Jason did, he was very good at just going, I'll come back to it, and then would come back and go, it's this. But obviously having the patience and the confidence to go away, and I'm just like broken leg, like everyone's got broken legs, okay, don't panic, we'll sort it out. And then, as you said, the like the cozy scenes and the intimate scenes as well, that vulnerable scene, I did get that. But again, it's that sort of thing, like, how do you justify the clearing a condition or getting a clue or anything like that? So you're right. I don't think it's just something that different play styles maybe adapt to it quicker, perhaps, and are just better at improving it. But it's one of those things where I definitely know I've struggled with it myself, and it's one of those things where I go, the more practice I do at it, the better I become, and being aware of it. So, and the same with the custom move stuff. I've never written anything homebrew, and the thought of doing custom move for like Powered by the Apocalypse, I'm like, no, that'll just be fine. I'm not going to even think about it. I'm not going to give that as an option, just because I don't want to get it wrong. But then again, that's on me to get better at it and to play more games where I'm like, oh well, this makes so much sense. So it's very interesting that you had two different almost versions of it, like someone who was very experienced and be able to give something, and then one the way you're trying to work it out yourself.
For me, I was just at the point where I knew enough about Powered by the Apocalypse moves to go, that's not right because it's not doing anything that the core moves that you've all got do.
Yeah.
But I'm not good enough at this to fix that.
Yeah.
I can't come back at you with the correct version of this move. This move is already covered by the rules. It's interesting you mentioned like conditions and not handing them out. It literally says in the between book, it says players will forget to use items in their personal quarters. Happens straight away. The GM will forget to give out conditions. And I got a really bit of great advice. And the Gauntlet Discord is one of the most amazing Discords I think I'm in. And I actually had one bad session of the between, and it was funny because all my players were like, we did not notice anything wrong. But for me, like, I didn't get through all the unseen prompts. I felt like I was rushing towards night phase stuff that I felt like we were getting close to, and it went past its half an hour kind of cut off time, and we were all tired and everyone had been at work all day. And it was one of those games, and I felt kind of pretty bummed out about it. And I was like, I didn't give out a single condition. And I was explaining all this in the Gauntlet Discord. And someone, I can't remember the name, but they gave great advice. They just said, if something happens in the story, and you see Jason do this all the time, just ask the player how they feel. So they're like, oh, I've just seen like a ghost or whatever. You know, how did that make your character feel? And they was like, well, I was pretty unnerved. Right, take the condition unnerved. The end.
He's like, it's great. Just like, handing it back over to players. Yeah, I love that.
So and but my players got wise to it. By the end, I was like, how did that make you feel? And they were like, I'm all right, actually. So
I like that. No, that's so true. Like, handing it back to the players about just, again, helping you out in the moment of like, how do you feel? And they'll like, unnerved is not a word I would use. Like, oh yeah, that's a great one.
I don't think there is anything more powerful in role-playing games as a player or a GM or person who runs the game than asking questions, because questions lead to answers which lead to more questions, and you don't tell a shared story from my perspective of one person writing all the lore and everything and trying to shoehorn other people's bits of story into it. You discover things together. They're one of the tenets of Powered by the Apocalypse games is play to find out, which is very noble, I think, as a pursuit when you play. But like, I prefer the rephrasing of that, which is, I don't know, let's find out. Which is the idea that there isn't some hierarchy of who is responsible for the story. And I've always said, this is bullshit, right? I haven't always said this. I've come to this realization in the last year, right? You know, when people say, "Oh, I'm a forever DM," right? I kind of recoil at that. And I think it's for games like D&D where you can't really get away with doing nothing. You have to prep at least. So even if you're super experienced, you have to at least know what stat blocks are and vaguely what's going on, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have started to realize that the GM in games that I like playing is a player, right? That's not a new idea that the GM is a player.
Mm-hmm.
But I like to think of it as though I am a completely equal participant in this.
Yeah.
I'm just playing with asymmetric rules. So we're all playing this game and we are all, 20% responsible for telling this story. It's just that my sheet is different to your sheet. And that's the only difference between you and I. I don't have any more power than you, which also leads me to believe, and this is a controversial viewpoint, right? That 95% of prep and world building that GMs do by themselves is driven by their own ego.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. No, I'm with you on that.
And I think that there is this, and you see it sometimes with inexperienced DMs who, when you don't quite get to what they want you to get to, that they kind of bristle or they get a bit upset that like your characters are the cliche of talking to Steve the Goblin rather than, speaking to the nephew of the king who stood outside, who's got the clue for you, who desperately needs you to move the story along. And I think that I was the same. Like I said to you, that Star Wars game, I had written so much, and like every single shopkeeper in the town had some kind of backstory. After a while, you get used to like, oh, I'll recycle that somewhere else. It's fine. But I realized I was like, I want you to find out the detail and the lengths that I've gone to.
Yeah.
And then after a while, I just let go of that. And I was like, do you know what? Let's just find out. Yeah. Let's just play. And because I don't think that's a story. I don't think you telling me what you're doing in the world that I've done, that I know what's going to happen, is telling a story. And I've gravitated towards games that support that viewpoint.
Because I feel like there are better games that do that. And if you have a story that, and the players are like, yeah, we'll follow along with your story, that's where the D&D stuff lies, and that's why people gravitate towards that. But I agree. I'm so happy to... I mean, I'm very bad myself of coming up with like a character, like a unique concept. I'm always that person last in character creation, which I'm sure you'll find out when we do the Wild Sea, where I'm like, where do I fit in? I very rarely have a strong thought, but when someone does, or when the rare times I do, some people are like, oh yeah, and then they build upon that. And it sometimes like... That's why it's so important to have these session zeros, not only just for safety and all that sort of thing, but then the GM goes, oh, so they've made this character crew. Well, what kind of story can I tell to them that is interesting, that fits with their sort of what they're doing, rather than like, okay, and now you're in Barovia, Curse of Strahd is happening. Like, it doesn't suit what any of these characters you've created. It's different. It's a mixture of both. And I really like how you said that. Yeah, the GM is a player, but your rules are different. It's like, well, I don't necessarily have a character, but the character is the world that I can help, manifest in some way to get to where you want to go. And like you said, like sort of enjoy what your characters are doing and the stories they create, because you wouldn't be able to create it by yourself with that novel that you're writing, and then they play in it and they go, well, they've ruined it, and they haven't ruined it. They are just interacting it as players do. They'll press the wrong button. They'll talk to Boblin the Goblin and hope for the best. Obviously stories like, Critical Role and all that sort of, all these actual plays now, where I think that's the transition period. Now people are like, oh, we can do it together and enjoy the collaborative storytelling. I think, that shift in mindset, something I've definitely welcomed. It's, as you said, easy on the GM. You don't have to worry about it. And my ego is already big enough as it is. I'd rather have it in the game rather than like, this is my design, do the steepled like hands as a GM and go, good, excellent,
I'd rather have the ego boost of my table saying, that was incredible. How did you come up with that? And me say, I didn't. We just kind of bluffed that. And where I felt like the most rockstar GM is where, just one detail has come out of someone else's suggestion, and that they brought it up because it's something that's pertinent to their character, and you've just given them enough to follow that little trail of breadcrumbs. And I think that it's the same with like improv, right? Like you get good improv you get from your partner, right? Your scene partners, you are, trading back and forth. And my favorite moments of running the Between and my favorite moments of running games full stop are those moments where you're just kind of in that in the moment itself. And, you know, I mean, maybe it goes back to El Duende, like when El Duende's there and you just know exactly what kind of string to pull on, what kind of thread they're going to be interested in. And The Between does this really well by kind of mechanizes this, that like, you know, it gives you all those locations and side characters, and you can just kind of see what your table finds interesting. You might introduce a character, you know, I think we did the Creature of Cremorne Gardens, which is one of my favorite threats in the Between. It's basically a Scooby-Doo mystery. It's a haunted theme park, and you know, and it's got one of the rarest, one of the only instances in the Between where you have to work out if it's a hoax or if it's real. And, you know, the first character they met when they went to the Cremorne Gardens was the person who owns Cremorne Gardens. They were like, nope, no interest in talking to that guy. So then Albertina Welk, who is the bon vivant, the dancer who is on the dancing platform every night, who does the tango, then she became the most interesting part of the story, because there was a scene where she danced with my American from the table, and the scene was so important, he made a custom move based around her. And then she came back in the end in the mastermind. It was like, you know, you just have to... It's a real thing of like, okay, well, they're not going for this character, or they're not going to choose to go down this avenue. I've got all these other options, and the Between from behind the screen, as it were, is an absolute joy to run, because you're saying, and I was very apprehensive at first because I was like, okay, I don't know how this is going to go. I need lots of ideas in case they go down these things. Well, no, you don't. You just need to let go, see what they want to do. The first question of every day is, what do you want to do today? Yeah. And they tell you what you want to do. And in the daytime, you have to let them, right? Because the daytime, they can do what they want. Nighttime, you ask them what they want to do, and you're like, that's interesting. And then and then sometimes you let them want to do, and then you go, actually, no, here comes a monster.
Yeah. I love that.
And it's you know, it's really great. And it's, I found that incredibly fulfilling from behind the screen to walk that tightrope every night.
We said like the keeper doesn't necessarily have a character, but ultimately there is this shadow oversees everything, which is this idea of the mastermind, this idea that this is the villain, the big bad, etc., that your monster hunters are sort of fighting against. How did you find like playing that sort of role, or having that sort of role throughout your campaign? Because I know people do it very differently. There's obviously different masterminds you can have. Certainly I know in the next edition of the Between as well. Because it's one of those things where, again, very similar to me, in Brindlewood Bay, is that you have these sort of void clues, and the Eldritch thing, is everything is sort of there, but you don't get the full impact unless you play a much longer campaign. It's very hard to get quick clues about like, oh, it's the mastermind, you know, like making it justify in a story. I think you need a longer time with it.
Yeah, the mastermind is a lot of fun, right? And the advice that they give in the book is that like the mastermind is your character essentially, and the players should get a thrill every time they appear. The mastermind is interesting in the Between because it also says in the book that, you know, by modern standards, the mastermind's motives are actually quite sympathetic. And the default mastermind is Theodora Brathwaite, who is, you know, a pirate queen from Barbuda who has been treated dreadfully by, you know, imperial expansion. And, you know, she wants to wreak revenge on the Empire. You don't know why. And this is something that we haven't actually said in the game, that, like, there are no canonical answers for anything in the Between. When you play a threat, like, you know, you're investigating the Creature of Cremorne Gardens, your players find clues, and it's up to them to use those clues to decide, which is one of the most thrilling things of that game, watching players conspiracy theory Charlie from Always Sunny around, kind of with the red string, trying to tie these disparate clues together. But the mastermind is really fun because the way it is mechanically drip fed into the story, I think once the characters find one mastermind clue, you have to have your mastermind is always revealed in the same way, I think. Or no, they're always, the first appearance is you have to come up with a way of having a character see them. So I had them do it, and I kind of revealed the mastermind, and then you get to do a post-credit scene. So after we had done our wrap-up and we'd arranged, you know, like, hey, it was really nice to see everyone. Oh, actually, there is one more thing. And then came up with this post-credit scene. And then they know, okay, I don't think they even learned her name until halfway through, which is the difference if you play with the Explorer. The Explorer knows who the mastermind is off the bat, right? But I found revealing the information, because there's 5 stages to the mastermind. Their first appearance, then there is the post-credit scene, then there is some information about them. It's like 3 biographical bits of information of things that have happened to them in their past that you have to work into the story organically. And the way I did that is that the night that my American caused a scandal by dancing with Albertina Welk at Cremorne Gardens, this kind of outrageous, it was basically the Roxanne scene from Moulin Rouge,
very
right?
good.
It kind of scandalized polite society.
Yeah.
So what I did was I knew I wanted them to get some information in there. I had Theodora turn up at that scene. She saw it and she gave a round of applause. And they were like, oh, it's the woman again with the sapphire. That's all they knew her as.
Yeah.
And then I wrote a gossip column, like Lady, what's her name in Bridgerton? Lady Whistledown. So I work in a library, right? And the library where I work has got a fairly extensive Victorian literature collection.
Incredible.
So I went and did a bunch of research on a lunch break and read a bunch of society papers, right?
Incredible.
So I took a couple of names of writers. There was one person who was a fairly prolific society paper writer called Gaston, and another one called Hook, and made a character called Gaston Hook.
Nice.
And I basically had them write a column called Man About Town. And the first action of the next session, after everyone had done their dawn moves and all this kind of stuff, is the factotum went to get the papers.
Yeah.
And I said, here is something you read.
No.
And I got the factotum to read the society paper, which basically had a report on the scandalous dance the American had done the night before, and B said, oh, it was a rare sighting of Theodora Brathwaite, and then the biographical details about her that someone in the news would know, but my characters didn't, then got read out to the table.
Amazing.
So I got a huge kick out of doing that.
Yeah.
Also, it gave me something to do at work on a quiet day.
I was gonna say, as someone who doesn't do much prep, that feels like a lot of prep.
That was the most prep I did, and if you think about it, it had absolutely nothing to do with running the game or whatever. It was all flavor, which was like really fun. But the cool thing about the Mastermind is, and it's actually changed in the new edition, in the original edition, now known as the preview edition, you found these Mastermind clues, which were tied to the Mastermind, but they act like a timer. And once you get to 15, then all other threats, once you've resolved those, you don't introduce any more, and then you have to face off against the Mastermind. And in the old version of the game, the keeper has to write the Mastermind threat.
Yes.
Which, when I first started playing the game and I read that, I was like, absolutely fucking not.
Yeah,
I cannot write that. But then you start to realize how threats work, how clues work.
Yeah.
Writing clues was one of my favorite things, because you have to write these vague clues that can't answer a question, right?
Yeah.
You can't say, oh, a letter that says I did it by Theodore Brathwaite, and, my plan by Theodore Brathwaite. You can't just have that. You have to have these vague clues that give them something to do. And I did that, and I feel like I'm really pleased that I played it the old way first.
Yes.
Because I actually think the changes are better.
Yeah.
In the new version, the clues that you actually find do help you. You can use those to answer the question, which means that you can answer the question quicker and perhaps introduce a second mastermind if you resolve the first one. But also, it's now harder to find mastermind clues.
Okay.
It's kind of a trade-off, but it means that the clues that you find throughout the game are now tied to the mystery, rather than you've answered clues, the timer's over, here's a brand new mystery.
Yeah.
So I really like doing that, but I tell you what, it didn't half teach me about running the game and how threats work and how things. So I'm pleased that the change has been made, but I'm really glad that I did it once, like the old ways.
That's really interesting. Yeah, because I would definitely go for that second thing of like running it. But it's that teaching you how to play the game, how to run the game, and then doing something unique. I agree. I think if I'd seen that, I'd gone, nope. They'll never see the mastermind. They'll be like a woman, and that's it. And oh no,
yeah. And the thing is like as you build the mastermind up over time, the sheet actually tells you what side characters do you want to bring back for the mastermind threat. And we'd had a bunch of side characters that my players got a real kick out of. And then when you get to the point where I don't have to write any side characters for this, because they're already there. I've got them from the other threats. I don't have to write any locations really, because we've already been to these places before. And yeah, it's a real thrill. Like, honestly, like I could talk about the Between all day and all night, because I think it is a masterpiece of a game. And my players, when it was over, I was like, look, I know I said this was one and done, but there's a new version coming out. I know that there's a bunch of playbooks we didn't use. There's a bunch of playbooks in the expanded content from the original edition that we didn't use. Do you want to do a season 2? We're like, we'll do it next year. And everyone was just like, absolutely, like,
yay,
psyched to do it. But you've got that whole difficult second album syndrome of like, can we
lightning in a bottle
repeat again?
You're right. I think a lot of the time then, is it capturing that sort of nostalgia stuff? Like, again, I've had the same thing with the D&D stuff, but I think from my brief tiny bit of experience with The Between, it's one of those ones where I would really enjoy a long campaign of it, and it'll be different each time. So I'm very, very jealous you're doing it for round 2. My sort of final question to you then is, like, if someone was picking up The Between for the first time, a brand new GM or like is about to run it, what sort of your big bit of advice would it be to help them run the game?
My first bit of advice would be to watch Jason's Shadow Society playthrough on his YouTube channel. Not only because you get to see the game run by the best person on the planet running it, which can fill you with a little bit of apprehension, but ultimately you'd rather learn from the best, I think. But the key thing about it is that 2 of the people in that group have not played The Between before. One of them is a co-writer on stuff for the Gauntlet. Another one, the person who plays The Undeniable, is, a very, very seasoned player of Gauntlet games. But 2 of the players are role players who have never played The Between before, and you get to watch them learn in real time. And I feel like their experience was quite similar to my players' experience in that at the start they were asking a lot of questions like, I don't know how this works, or I don't know what am I supposed to do here? And, they are guided through it by the table and the stuff they come out with by the end. And those 2 characters the people who hadn't played The Between before, they are the mother and the factotum respectively. So they are kind of a double act, and their story is pretty incredible. And some of the stuff that comes out of that is remarkable. And this is 2 people who are like, I've not played any Carl from Brindlewood games, I've not even played Trophy, but I like games with like a narrative bent to them. And one of them, Mads, who plays the mother, like, she has a channel now where she just plays The Between, just plays Gauntlet games.
Perfect.
So that would be my main bit of advice. If my main bit of keeper advice is, don't get hung up on what the threat is. Just read it, listen to your players when they talk about what they want to do, and let them guide you. Because whilst it's fun in the night phase saying, what do you want to do? They say, I want to go to this house and investigate. And you go, no, you're going to get attacked by a vampire. That's you bringing the story and the threat of the mastermind, the threat of the things that are actually a threat with a capital T into the story. But during the day, you have to be really switched on and listening to what your characters want from this game. And then it's up to you to try and make as much of that happen as possible. And I think that's key for any role-playing game. Like, the GM should be like, well, my character has this goal in mind. And I openly ask my players, like, what do you want from this story? And you try and make it happen in the coolest way possible. But in The Between, it's mechanized to the point that you ask them at the start of every day, what do you want to do? And they have to answer you. And then you have to let them do it.
They have to make a decision. It's not like, what do you want to eat? And they go, I don't know, not fussy. Like, no, you need to tell me, because otherwise we don't start the game.
My worst sessions, or when I struggled the most, is where I hadn't read the threat through properly, or I introduced a new threat, having seen it run on an actual play, but not really fully read the thing. And I think sometimes there were a couple of threats where, like, the theme kind of got divorced from the action a little bit, and it's so well written that, like, you're supposed to investigate the themes whilst investigating this mystery. And there was a couple of threats that I felt like could have been a lot better had I perhaps been a little more familiar with exactly what was on the sheet.
Oh, well, Matt, thank you so much for spending precious hours of time when you're not talking about the Between, talking about the Between to me. I very much appreciate it. Where can we find your work? Where can we find you on the internet if people want to check out Ironsworn and you talking about the Between?
Yeah, so you can find my my YouTube channel if you just look for The Bad Spot. It will take you. I think the second option is a popular country song called The Bad Spot, but I'm kind of overtaking that jump now, and you can find me there. You'll find me on social medias at The Bad Spotcast. I'm trying not to use Twitter these days. You can find me on Blue Sky, and I think that's kind of it. Yeah, you can find all my contact details on all of those things. But yes, it was lovely to speak to you, Fiona. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. No, I very much appreciate it. Well, you're also on podcasts now, I see. So you're everywhere.
Yeah, so I did my YouTube channel was video, but when I started it, my video camera was very bad, so it ended up being audio only but a video, but on top of the video there was dice rolls and animated dice rolls and rules explanations, and the rule book came up. But I realized very quickly that people only listen to it, and I was so stubborn because everyone was like, when is this going to appear as audio only? And I was like, never. So I waited until I finished the entire Starforge campaign, which is 62 episodes and 70 plus hours of me talking to myself, and I've started to slowly drip feed them through
slowly but surely
to the audio platform. So you can find the audio only version of the Starforged on Spotify podcast and Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else you get your audio delights.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And absolute pleasure. We'll definitely have you back on if you're willing to talk about the Wildsea, probably once we've done it and be like, oh, that was really good. Because that is another game which I've read through and I've very much enjoyed, and it's be interested to see playing a short campaign of it as well. But thank you so much, folks, for listening to this episode of the DM's Book Club. We'll be back next week with hopefully another exciting episode. It might be the Between again. We might just carry on talking. That's what I'm interested in doing. But thank you so much for listening, folks, and we will see you next time. Goodbye.
Bye.